Good evening, everybody, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to the Spectator and Spectator TV for having us this evening, and all of the staff working behind the scenes to make the Alternative Conference happen. My name is John O'Connell, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, and I'm delighted to host this event this evening that we've titled, How Do We Clean Up the State? And we saw at the start of the week that Charles Moore and Paul Dacre were touted for the chair roles at the BBC and Ofcom respectively. And regardless of one's views on their suitability for those roles, at the heart of that debate lies the idea that public life is somewhat unbalanced, that the right tends to win elections, but the left actually run the country because they dominate institutions. Is that true? In 2012, the TPA research found that of those who declared a political affiliation, 5 times more Labour appointees found their ways into public bodies than Tories. And we updated that research earlier this year, and it showed that almost half declared allegiance to the Labour Party, compared to less than a third for the Conservatives. So the TPA has led the way on fighting for diversity of thought in our public institutions. And furthermore, we've long campaigned for a rationalisation of the sprawling Quango state. So we're going to touch on those topics and more this evening. We only have half an hour, so I'll very quickly introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll speak. James Frayne is the founding partner of the research firm Public First. Douglas Carswell is the former MP for Clacton and the founder of the Good Governance Project. And Madeline Grant is the assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph. So I'll ask each speaker to set out their thoughts for around 3 to 4 minutes. And then hopefully, if you fire in some Q&A, we'll be able to get that going to keep the conversation going for the full half hour. So as I mentioned, I'll go straight over to you, James.
Thanks very much, John. And thanks to the Spectator for having us all on. You know, it's a huge question about whether or not there is balance in the sort of quangocracy, to use one of your words, and what needs to be done about it. I think it's interesting how there's been, with the floating of Charles Moore and Paul Dacre's candidacies, there's sort of, I mean, just a sense of complete disbelief, as if is it possibly one of the jokes coming out of Number 10? I mean, why would they ever do such a thing? And I think it's as you say, we'll put the merits of the appointments to one side for the moment, but I think it is a reflection of the fact that people think that the state ultimately is sort of owned by the left. That people can't believe for 1 minute that you would have people that lean right in positions of cultural influence. And I think this is generally true of public life. You know, you have, I think, you know, you have a government which has an 80-seat majority, and yet there is a sense sort of projected, I think, through much of the media, almost as if there was a coup, that they were never voted in, that there was a sort of illegitimate government, which is an extraordinary place to be. And given that they have an 80-seat majority, they entirely politically dominate England, certainly, and probably England and Wales for that matter. And yet somehow the centre right is constantly on the back foot. You know, it's constantly, there's this constant sense of it sort of doesn't have any sort of moral or cultural legitimacy. And, you know, how do we go about changing that? I think honestly it's going to be very hard, because I think even our side almost sort of finds it hard to keep a straight face when people like Paul Dacre or Charles Moore are suggested for these roles. It's almost like, you know, laughing behind our hands that we're sort of doing something outrageous and shocking, and we're really going to stick it to the left, where, as you say, actually, arguably, it's really just about rebalancing cultural institutions so they reflect the country more generally. Again, not particularly talking about Dacre or Charles Moore as people particularly, more the fact that it doesn't seem so terrible to have people like that in positions of cultural influence, in the way that we wouldn't be shocked if we found that Alan Rusbridger was in the running to be chairman of the BBC or something like that. So I think absolutely there needs to be a rebalancing, but it's not just a political rebalance. It's not just a political rebalancing. I think there's a rebalancing towards mainstream opinion across the country. By that I mean, we have to, and I think, to be fair to the Director General of the BBC is looking at this, there has to be a way of reflecting mainstream provincial opinion from the rest of the country in the cultural institutions of this country. Which, anyway, no doubt we'll explore all these things a bit more over the course of the discussion.
James, thank you very much. As I mentioned, it's quite tight for time, so I'll go straight over to Douglas Carswell.
Over the past generation, we've seen the administrative state run by what you might call the Blairite ascendancy. And it doesn't really matter who it is that people vote for. The same sort of people with the same soft left prejudices, sometimes not very soft left, end up running the country. And this means that it doesn't often really matter who it is that the voter votes for. We end up with the same sort of people presiding over public life. And I think we need to ask some questions on the centre-right, some strategic questions as to what we do about this. It's very easy for us to simply see it as a case of musical chairs amongst Quangocrats, but it has profound implications for the country. If you allow your institutions and the institutions of the state to become the preserve of the soft left, you end up with institutions that don't reflect public priorities, institutions that, because they're insulated from public opinion, tend to be, I would say, incompetent, like the Department of Public Prosecution, and institutions that tend to be quite woke. And we see the consequences of 30 years of the left ascendancy in our institutions, when day after day we hear another institution or big public body or publicly funded organization promoting a leftist Guardianista agenda. What do we do about it? Well, it's easy to say scrap the Quangos. All governments on the centre-right tend to say that in opposition. They don't actually tend to deliver. I think we need to be much more strategic about using the levers of prime ministerial patronage. We need to not just sort of tinker. May and Cameron were both utterly useless at promoting like-minded people. I'm not sure that they knew what was in their mind, let alone like-minded people's minds. So they were utterly useless at promoting centre-right people to positions of influence. We need to be, under Boris, much more strategic. It's not just the BBC. It's not just the positions of influence at Oxford colleges, right down to the chairman of the Council for Widget Standards. We need to be really strategic and ruthless in how we promote people who are like-minded. We also need fundamentally to make the administrative state properly accountable. You need to have a system where if you run a large Quango, and you use public money, you should be annually accountable as the head of that organization for your budget. For non-departmental public bodies, that means that you should appear annually before the Select Committee, the House of Commons, and frankly, if you don't get the say-so for your budget, you should be sacked. You need that level of hyper-accountability, because ultimately, as James knows better than anyone in this conversation, there are a heck of a lot of people in provincial England, blue-collar Britain, who I think want to see change. And if Boris and his gang don't deliver far-reaching fundamental change, then why bother? We'll end up with the country being run by the same sort of Blairite Cameron ascendancy, and they'll just give up on voting for anyone at all.
Thank you, Douglas, and we'll go straight over to Madeline Grant from the Daily Telegraph.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I share many of the concerns raised by Douglas and James, but I think there is a sort of a vague dose of optimism. I think the time now is right for the bonfire of the Quangos that's been promised for so long, partly because I think in many ways they have responded. The public is under the pressure of the pandemic. The public has been given a glimpse of just how ill-equipped and how ineffective many of these Quangos are. And that scrutiny is quite a departure, because for a long time they've sort of, as it were, operating in the shadows. They haven't got attracted enough media coverage. It's kind of relied on the efforts of organisations like the TPA to keep the scrutiny going. They haven't attracted much public interest. In a way, they've benefited from their own banality, because it's simply so hard to distinguish between so many of these forgettable acronyms, and there are just so many of them. Organisations like the TPA have something of a job on their hands just keeping track of how many there are. So it's no wonder that reining them in has proven difficult. Propped up with public money, They lack all of the kind of checks and balances of normal politics, as Douglas was explaining. There's no obvious metric for measuring their success. And of course, they're never exposed to any of the punishments that would normally await failed organisations and companies in the open market. But as I mentioned, the last year in politics has exposed many Quangos as being incredibly ineffective. And I think in some ways the public has had a bit of a brutal awakening in a way that for a long time, the only people raising awareness of these things have been people on the right of politics with a particular interest in reforming the state. So first, the Electoral Commission, after finding Leave campaigners innocent of any wrongdoing on 2 separate occasions, they then opened a third misguided investigation into Brexiteers, only to be humiliatingly proven wrong yet again. Then, of course, the walking car crash of Public Health England attempted to launch a centralised testing system, which again proved woefully inadequate. And in some cases, in their quest for kind of command and control at all costs, they shamefully turned down offers of assistance from private labs. Then we had Ofqual on the fiasco over A-level exam grading. And then it's not quite the Quangocracy exactly, but I think it's very symptomatic of what often goes wrong with the Quangocracy. Dido Harding, the ultimate chumocrat, was appointed to be the temporary head of the organisation designed to replace Public Health England, despite presiding over failure first at Talk Talk and then with the government's own track and trace system. So the Quangos have had a very bad war indeed. And I think for the first time, the public is getting a first-hand glimpse of the kind of things that people like the TPA, James and Douglas, have been warning of for some time. Failing upwards, that sense of the kind of revolving door which propels Quangocrats from cushy job to cushy job, and then sometimes to Oxbridge College professorships and so on. So I think there is a pretty extraordinary opportunity there. And it coincides with the time when, you know, the Tories have an 80-seat majority, and they are apparently moving in the right direction with, you know, axing PHE, considering appointing Conservatives to key roles in Ofcom and the BBC. But I'm also seeing some familiar problems, and again, it all goes back to the lack of accountability. I think perhaps because people are still not particularly familiar with the Quangocracy, politicians are still being blamed for whatever goes wrong. People aren't really aware that PHE was technically in charge of preparing for the epidemic. The guy in charge tends to get the blame. So in a way, politicians are kind of reaping what they sow, because for a very long time, many elected officials preferred to delegate important functions to these bodies of the greater the good and the experts than actually put in the time themselves and be fully accountable. But when the chips are down, the politicians still get blamed for everything. So that sort of takes some of the urgency away from reforming the Quangocracy. And the Tories also playing catch up big time. They weren't anything like as active in making public appointments during the Cameron years as Labour were under Blair, when they were particularly prolific. I saw earlier today that the guys at Guido had crunched the numbers, and they found that since 1997, there have only been 2 years when Tories got more public appointments than Labour, which is truly astounding when you consider they've been in charge for a decade. So what should we do next? I mean, James put it very well. He said that, you know, quite fundamentally need to start acting like a party with an 80-seat majority and sort of hold their heads up high and not be so squeamish about the idea that these public appointments should legitimately go to Conservatives. You know, we live in a country that voted an 80-seat majority and voted for Brexit, and you wouldn't know it from looking at the state of these appointments. I'd also very much like to have Quango representatives appearing before select committees annually, having to sit there and squirm and state why they should continue to receive public funds. It should be something that is annually accountable, and they have to justify themselves properly. I think more functions of Quango should be devolved to local authorities where there is proper democratic accountability. But I do think perhaps it's too early to say this, but I'm quietly optimistic. I mean, I think you only have to look at the way that people like the overreaction of someone like Alistair Campbell to the news of the rumours of appointments of Paul Dacre and Charles Moore to see that I think we are going in the right direction. Alistair Campbell said, "This country is run by a right-wing clique in which appointments like this are made not according to ability or values, but getting like-minded right-wingers to do the dirty work," which is truly extraordinary from the man who presided over so many of these crony-ish appointments. So I think we are on the right track, but there's still plenty of work to do.
Thank you, Maddie. I'm just going to ask you the first question off the back of that, actually. We talk about rebalancing, but do you feel that perhaps the centre-right or small C Conservatives, however you want to frame it, we could go too far the other way and end up stuffing the institutions with, people from that side of the fence, and you'd actually imbalance it, but just in the other direction?
I'm not sure that there's that danger yet. Certainly not yet. I mean, as I say, the frenetic reaction of many on the left to these what should be fairly inoffensive appointments, actually looking at the broad sweep and thrust of it, I don't see that danger. If anything, I think the bigger danger is that because I think Conservatives have often, what I'm seeing a trend recently is Conservatives are often quite dismissive of things like humanities degrees and the arts, which is I don't agree with that myself, because I think it's very important that you have Conservatives who are in that world who can then take up these public appointments. I think if anything, the problem is going to be a shortage of eligible Conservatives who could take up these roles.
I mean,
okay. Thank you, Douglas. Could I just ask you? Sorry, please go ahead, Douglas.
I'm a free market classical liberal, but I wouldn't want to see every appointment going to free market classical liberals. I think the key in this is plurality. The reason why public administration in this country is so often so bad and so dire is because it's presided over by people marinated in a groupthink, in a lazy groupthink. What you need to do is you need to ensure there's a plurality of opinion. And that doesn't mean, replacing the cliched thought of the Cameron Blair ascendancy with a new set of cliches from a Boris Johnson ascendancy. You need to make sure that you have genuine plurality of thought. And where you have groups of experts appointed to give advice to ministers, you need to make sure that those experts are competing in that advisory giving process. You need to allow good ideas to drive out bad ones. That's the key, rather than pointing any particular brand or flavour of outlook.
And Douglas, just to extend on something you mentioned earlier with Quango's going before the relevant select committee annually to argue for their budgets. Do you think actually the Quango appointments, pre their appointment, should face a hearing from the relevant committee, or is that going too far?
Absolutely. I mean, there is something at the moment called pre-appointment confirmation hearings, and it's a sort of halfway house, because it's a sort of, it's not hardwired into the system across the board for all Department of State, non-departmental public bodies. It's allowed pretty much, I think, at the discretion of ministers. But we need a system of confirmation hearings. Given that the House of Commons has got its act together and freed the sort of nefarious hand of the whips in terms of deciding who gets to sit on the select committees, because there's now a competitive process to decide who the chairs of the select committees are, and there's a competitive process to decide who gets to sit on the select committees. Given that the House of Commons has now got control over the select committees, we now need to trust the House of Commons select committees to have the final say over some of these appointments. And frankly, that is going to mean sometimes Tory appointees getting vetoed by majority Tory select committees. But that's what happens in a democracy. That's what happens in the United States. That is preferable to what we have at the moment, where frankly some pretty mediocre people get put into really important jobs without people having the opportunity to challenge them. And we pay a really heavy price for this. So I would give select committees power not only to approve the budgets of these Quangos annually, but also to confirm the appointments of those put in charge of them.
And possibly annually to look at the mission of the organisation to prevent mission creep. Would that be something they should look at?
I wouldn't do that. Personally, I would use the charter letter system that they have in Australia, so that the centre of government is mandating each Department of State, each cabinet minister with a charter letter explaining what it is that that minister is expected to do. And then it's up to the minister to make sure that the various Quangos they notionally give direction to fulfill the strategic priorities of the government in light of that charter letter. I wouldn't involve Parliament beyond controlling the appointment of the chief of the Quango and the annual confirmation of the budget. If you do that, the rest will fall into line.
Okay, thank you. James, I wonder if I could come back to you. with your work with Public First and various polling and focus grouping, to what extent is this a salient issue with the public? And if it's not, what changes need to be made in order to get them to sit up and take notice?
I think it isn't at all. I think the public have no idea about the nature of the way that they're run. They have no idea about the relationship between, say, Department of Health, the NHS, Public Health England, etc. And I wanted to return something that Madeline said at the start, really, which is really important, which is that politicians are held accountable for the mistakes of Quangos in their space. So, you had, during the pandemic, obviously still happening, you get Matt Hancock taking heat for stuff that he might say was the responsibility of Public Health England, but Matt Hancock can't intervene in a lot of the stuff that they're doing because he doesn't have authority to do so. And I think it was, and obviously it grew, the sort of Quangos, they've been growing for a long time, but they obviously surged under Labour. And I think politicians thought post giving the Bank of England independence, I think they thought this was a sort of clever way of insulating themselves from a lot of controversial decisions, because they could say, well, it wasn't us, it was this independent Quango run by independent experts. But as Madeline says, when it comes down to it, that doesn't wash with the public. I mean, when I was director of comms at the DfE, this is going back nearly 10 years, and the number of Quangos that, I wanted to get control of from a communications perspective, because there was mistakes going left, right and centre, but I couldn't touch them. I mean, it used to drive us crazy. And I think actually there are too many Quangos. Lots of them should be folded into essentially into their parent departments, so that the politicians who are accountable can actually make decisions regarding how they're run, and ultimately so they're not just hanging left blamed for mistakes which aren't really their control. So all of these health Quangos, I would say, fold them back into central administration, and then take a great big sword to them and start cutting them down to size. But if we're going to have proper accountability, they've got to fold into the parent departments.
That's a really interesting point, James, because I suppose part of the perennial problem with the Quango state is that even when action is taken to roll up a Quango, what happens is that the function itself isn't removed. So you just see a set of staff move from one organisation to another. Do you feel folding a Quango back into a department just risks, bringing the problem back in-house rather than getting rid of the problem to start with?
It does, but at least you can do something about it. So, again, sorry to go on about, anecdotal sort of war stories and stuff, but, when I was at the DfE, I wanted as much folded back into the department so that I could cut it down to size, because there's nothing worse when you're in a department, particularly like the DfE, which is terribly publicly exposed. You've got these Quangos running around doing stuff that you have absolutely no control over, no authority over, no knowledge about what the blooming hell they're actually going to do. And in any case, as I say, you haven't, or as you said, you haven't cut down the size of the state anyway. So you've nominally cut down the size of the DfE, but it's just the state sitting off in little islands that you don't control. So I don't think that it is all of a sudden sort of growth of departments and the sort of regrowth of the state. It's merely bringing greater accountability so you can actually, as I say, hold it to account, manage it better, and ultimately cut it down to the size it needs to be.
Right, thanks. Maddie, a question's come in from a viewer, which is, would putting centre-right or small c conservatives into public roles in this way, would it add to this sort of fuel of the culture war that we're having? Would it lead to a widening between left and right?
I think the culture war is here and it's being fought, and the right can't really afford not to take part. So no, I don't think it would fuel it anymore. I mean, it depends it depends how you feel about the culture war, I suppose, if you think it's a battle worth fighting. I mean, I think it is, and I think that the right has to, or they will lose a lot of what they hold dear. So I think it's inevitable. I just think that it's important to push back in quite a sensible way to these accusations of cronyism, perhaps by reminding people of the way that public appointments have historically tended to go, using the kind of statistics that I mentioned from the Guido Fawkes have complied. And of course, there's tons and tons of material on this from the TPA. I think to remind, when you put it in that kind of context, it doesn't look so cronyist after all. And there are always going to be the Alistair Campbells of this world who have an interest in stirring things up and claiming that something is some mad right-wing conspiracy, when in fact it's just very standard practice and very modest practice in comparison with how things have been done prior to that. I mean, there are culture war agitators on both sides who have an interest in stirring this up, but I think if it can be put into its proper context, you will take some of the toxicity out of it.
Okay, thank you. Douglas, lots of politicians, when they're on the back benches or in opposition, they talk a good game on a small state, but don't necessarily, follow up on that when they win an election or get into government. What is there anything that we can do to get backbenchers or people who are talking a good game to hold their nerve when they actually get into government?
You're so right. So often you hear people who used to be ministers at the twilight of their careers, particularly on the centre right, wishing that they had actually started to change some of the fundamentals of apparatus and architecture of the state to effect change. I'm an optimist. I think that maybe what COVID and the coronavirus crisis has done, it's demonstrated very visibly to a lot of people, particularly people in Westminster who are one step removed from the centre of power. It's a bit like that moment in The Wizard of Oz when the curtain's drawn back. We tend to think of these Quangos as being incredibly clever, sophisticated, benevolent organizations. But like the Wizard of Oz, they turn out to be just a rather confused, muddled, middle-aged male. And I think the extent to which the Quango state is run by slightly confused, befuddled people who don't really know what they're doing, I think this is a sea change. This, I think, should allow people on the centre right to actually start to talk about deconstructing the administrative state, to actually wind down entire tranches of government officialdom. There are whole swathes of government that I think we could argue now that we could best do without. And I wonder if one of the longer term consequences of this crisis is that it allows us to popularise the argument to ratchet back the size of the state. Government is not that smart, and I think people can see that now. Okay.
James, I wonder if I could come to you and another finding from some TPA research. We obviously looked at the political affiliations. We also looked at the regional disparity in public appointments. I suppose a big challenge for a Conservative government is to try and encourage people from different areas of the country to start applying for these roles as well. I mean, do they even know these roles exist? And how can we get successful businessmen and women from around the regions to get involved?
I think that one of the problems with the Conservative Party is it's fundamentally southern and posh, and that hasn't really changed. And that remarkable memoir that was published by my brains are sift these days.
Just Wire.
Yeah, I mean, when you end up sort of talking about the working class pivot of the Conservative Party, you can sort of occasionally convince yourself that it's happened. Really hasn't happened. The party is still culturally a million miles away from the people it represents, and I think that it's going to therefore be difficult for them to do a provincial rebalance along the lines that they ought to be looking at. They just don't know these people. We've used, Madeline and Douglas have used the word optimism a couple of times. I'm not optimistic about things at all. I'm very pessimistic. I think that time is rapidly elapsing during this Parliament. And I think, before we know it, we're going to be a year out from an election. And the party hasn't really undertaken the sort of necessarily cultural shift that it needs to take. So I would like to end on a moment of darkness, and that's where I'll leave it for me.
No, that's not like you, James, at all.
No, that's still.
Just to finish, it's quite often discussions about Quangos. It sometimes reminds me of regulations. Everyone knows that they're bad, but they can't name a bad one. Douglas, what Quangos do you think could be for the job?
The Electoral Commission would be first in the firing line. We don't need it. It's a waste of time. In fact, it undermines democracy. It's bad for democracy. The Charity Commission is a monstrosity. It actually inhibits civic society doing charitable deeds. And one thing that really annoys me is when Conservatives point out that they've appointed a so-called notional Tory to preside over these institutions. That just legitimizes the socialist agenda of these bodies. I'd get rid of them. I would get rid of a whole tranche of government Quangos, but I would start with the Charity Commission and the Electoral Commission. And you know what? If the leftist state wants to come out and defend the work of those bodies, I think that's a battle we could win. I think we could look at some of the payroll costs of the people who preside over those organizations, look at some of their dismal record and their misjudgments and their miscalculations. And I think that's a battle we could easily win and easily popularize.
Thank you. And Maddie, do you think broadcasters are a problem in this, i.e., the BBC, or do they take a Quango view as the expert view and that's it?
Yeah, I think they do. I think there's a big inherent bias towards statism and towards top-down methods of dealing with problems. And it's simply because the BBC, I think part of the problem is that they're so, it's a bit like, I suppose, what James was saying about the Tory party being southern and posh. I think the BBC is quite liberal, metropolitan. They all kind of think the same way, regardless of where they come from in the country. And the idea of the alternative viewpoint simply hasn't occurred to them because they're so rarely exposed to it. And it's very hard to correct your bias if you're not aware of it in the first place. So that presents a massive problem at the BBC. And I've noticed this a lot in how they've been covering the pandemic. When questioning ministers, the interviewer will often say things like, but if that, this lockdown doesn't work, if this local lockdown doesn't work, are you going to ramp it up a bit? Like the assumption being that working is, if it's not working, you should do more of it. The idea that might not be a good solution in the first place just doesn't occur to them. And I think that's a product of not having enough people of that worldview who work there in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We could talk about this for at least another half hour, if not more. But again, I'd like to thank the Spectator for having the Taxpayers Alliance on, and our guests this evening for joining us too. As has been mentioned a couple of times, this is an area of research for the TPA over many years. We've aimed to expose the extent to which public appointments are skewed one way, and indeed to expose the size and cost of the Quango state. And we've got some more work coming up on it very, very shortly. So thank you again to our guests. Thank you to Spectator, and sign up to receive our updates at taxpayersalliance.com. Thank you very much.